Patty Phillips, who's going to get our day started.
So thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. So good morning and welcome back to those of you who were here yesterday. I hope you had a great first day of this remarkable conference, and then greetings to those of you who are joining us for the first time this morning. As Daniel said, and I'm just confirming, I am Patty Phillips, the new Academic Dean at Mural College of Art and Design. Yesterday, I completed day 14 on the job. So I think I can still use the qualifier new, but I also know that this designation is going to be expiring very soon. But I'm really delighted to be a new denizen of Philadelphia and a member of Moore's deeply committed community of teachers and students, artists and designers, writers and scholars. I have felt genuinely welcome and also have felt so excited by the sort of fortuitous, intersection of my arrival in this wonderful, wonderful conference, as Daniel said, in its second iteration. It just has made my entry feel very vivid and very memorable. But my role this morning is to welcome all of you, and I do this with great pleasure. Yesterday, the wonderful Jane Golden welcomed us with striking opening remarks and expressions of deep gratitude for all of the organizers, participants, and importantly, the foundations and funders who have made inout possible in its second iteration. And I would just urge you to please take note for a few minutes in the program or in the booklet of the legion of people who have collaborated to make this possible, and acknowledge really what it requires to create and support these kinds of important opportunities for all of us. So, but I do want to just extend special thanks to Paul Farber and Daniel Tucker, and also to acknowledge many of my new Moore colleagues, faculty and students, and professional staff who have also been part of this project, as well as Jane and her colleagues at Mural Arts as well. The partnership between Mural Arts and Moore seems to be a very richly reciprocal and generative alliance, and it emanates all kinds of potential for the future, it seems to me. And I also just want to iterate something that Jane said yesterday, and I do want to very much acknowledge the vision of Moore's president, Cecilia Fitzgibbon, who saw the value of this kind of partnership. This kind of partnership lets academia go to a place and a space it needs to be in. And I hope that Mural Arts has also felt been a beneficiary of this really important alliance. So I think we're about to begin another day of sort of question and speculations and revisiting our convictions and our doubts about the work that we do. And with all of you, I look forward to today's program, which I know will really challenge and inspire us, and in many, many ways. And it will be started, of course, by the brilliant Michael Rakowitz, who has challenged and inspired my thinking and my writing over the years. Some thoughts, some questions. I don't know if this is what we'll be doing, but we may have some of these questions. We may have many of the others, of course. But what is the relationship of the social and ethics? Or for that matter, social and civic, or civic and ethics? What do we choose to pay attention to and why? And as a consequence, what do we ignore or overlook? Sometimes, I guess maybe could be seen as somewhat cynically written about public art, which I seem to have a very strong love-hate relationship with, but sometimes when we're looking at public art as either decoration or distraction or decoy or something, I always wonder, like, what is behind our back? As a consequence, what aren't we looking at? So I think we have to be very, thoughtful about that. What we're not paying attention to as well as what we are paying attention to. Also, so many of our projects, our work emanate from good intentions. But I think about artist Alfredo Jar, who laments in his own work that in some way every work fails, in some way. And how do we learn from these often difficult lessons, or maybe these difficult disappointments? And lastly, let me just, a brief passage or a summons from Godard, who wrote sort of a general quote, a paraphrase of it. It may be true that we are sometimes called to choose between ethics and aesthetics, but it is no less true that whichever one we choose, one will always find the other at the end of the road or the end of the journey. So again, I think part of this is looking at this entangled relationship between art, between ethics, between aesthetics, and I would also add political thought to this. So again, I thank so many dedicated people who have created this forum, this opportunity for all of us to question, to listen, and to speculate together. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm happy to be living in Philadelphia, which I also realize has been so important in my thinking about the public realm over the years. Some of the programs I've been a part of in Philadelphia over the years, the people that I have met and have done such important work. So I look forward to today, and let's begin.
Good morning. My name is Phoebe Durst, and I am a first-year MFA in the Community Practice Program here at Mural. It is my sincere privilege to introduce Michael Rakowitz. Michael's work is powerfully humbling and often references ancient Iraq art and presents the Iraqi diaspora in a splendid and vibrant context. Michael has been described by the Chicago Tribune as an artist who makes art less conceptual and more accessible. I will highlight briefly two works of which I am in awe. Parasite, begun in 1989, is a series of custom-built shelters for homeless persons that, when attached to the heating outtake vents of buildings, both inflate and warm. The 2010 installation, May the Arrogant Not Prevail, reappropriates the Ishtar Gate, made from Arabic foodstuff packaging found in Berlin, and speaks directly about the original gate being housed in Berlin and the Iraqi reconstruction, which is a scaled-down version. Michael's work has been seen in venues worldwide, including Documenta, MoMA, Mass Boca, Tate Modern, and many others. Michael is a professor of art, theory, and practice at Northwestern University and lives and works in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Michael Rakowitz.
I almost don't want to correct you because I like the idea of doing this Parasite project when I was 16. You just switch around 1997, and, you know, but that would make me very mid-career. But thank you. It's really lovely to be here. I'm deeply, deeply honored, and thank you, Phoebe, thank you, Patty, for such a nice introduction and for the day. And it wasn't long ago that we were together in Cornell doing something similar. And I want to thank especially for today Daniel Tucker. And let me just say that I'm from Chicago, and you guys owe us. Not only do we really, really miss Daniel, but you also have Anthony Romero and Abby Satinsky, so get working. You know, we miss them a lot, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Paul Farber. Moore College of Art. the last time I stood up here giving a talk, it was 7 years ago, at the invitation of Janet Kaplan, who was doing a symposium on art, activism, and curating. And we miss her a lot. She passed away more than a year ago, and I send my love to her daughter Dana, and to her friends and colleagues here who love and miss her very much. Thank you to everybody at the Moore College of Art. Hughes Center for Arts and Heritage, hopefully we'll get a chance. You know, you're going to be late, by the way. Daniel said it's going to be really, really to the minute. You're going to be late. That one might. And I want to thank the Hughes Center for Arts and Heritage for the support for the project that I'm doing with Mural Arts, and I'd love to thank everybody at Mural Arts. I'm going to miss names here, but I especially want to thank Jane Golden, Joan Riley, Brian Campbell, Caitlin Butler, Gabby Rashta, Nicole Steinberg, and especially Elizabeth Thomas, who is the curator who invited me to do this project. And somebody I've wanted to work with for 10 years, and someone who has been an amazing collaborator. I mean, really, it's been a collaboration, not just a curation. Leslie Lodwick, our departed to the West Coast, she's still alive, but she went to the West Coast. We miss her. I want to thank Melissa Fogg, who has been an amazing support for the Iraqi community here in Philadelphia with the Lutheran Family Services, which unfortunately closed, but she's now been hired by Mural Arts. So the economy and the ecology of this community is supporting one another. And to Teresa Rose, who was invaluable with her insight and her critical input when it came to proposing this project that hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about at the end of the talk. I mean, it's socially engaged art, but there's still images. Okay, great. Okay, good. All right. So in 2008, I spent a great deal of time in Redfern, a largely Aboriginal neighborhood in Sydney, Australia, producing a project that involved Indigenous citizens and organizations from that community for the Sydney Biennial. I was struck by the overt racism in the city, the ongoing crimes against and the displacement of Native Australians, now 250 years running. But there was something done as protocol that I felt kept the problems and failures visible and made them present, something I've tried to do in my work for the past 2 decades. In Australia, the Acknowledgement of Country is usually a statement or a speech made by an Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal to show respect to the traditional custodians of the land. I've often believed that the best way to forget someone important is to name a building after them, so their name disappears into an address, into the architecture. I'm sure that similar things have been said about the Acknowledgement of Country, but as an outsider, I was incredibly moved when I heard the preamble spoken at every public speech. I thought about my own context as an American living on Indigenous land, taken from its original inhabitants. To live up to my commitment to the citizens of Redfern, I made a promise to myself that I would continue to remind those who had forgotten. Since my return to the US, I've begun all my public lectures with this, an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to the elders, both past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and culture, and hopes of Native America. We must always remember that under the concrete and asphalt, this land is, was, and always will be traditional Indigenous land. So, as Phoebe mentioned, I have an ongoing project now for almost 20 years called Parasite. So these are images of a work that I feel creates the umbrella for so many of my projects, and it's ongoing. I go back to it every winter as it gets too cold to survive outside. But in summation, it's a series of custom-built inflatable shelters for the homeless that attach the exterior ventilation ports on buildings, so the warm air simultaneously inflates and heats these double membrane structures. I come to art from a background in design and architecture, with their expectations of utility and function. Thus, in my work doing, has been a critical moment. Art as shelter, art as para-archaeology, art as radical commercial enterprise. In 2006, the sustainable architect, Tony Fry, told me that this approach was illustrative of what he calls redirective practice, a cultural practice bridging disciplines and aiming toward ethical directional change. The move beyond disciplinary confinement can yield dramatic results. And for me, this is always rooted in some form of failure, often camouflaged by layers of efficacy. In each of these endeavors, I'm also consciously constructing a kind of failure and critique of problematic mechanisms. My mentor, Krzysztof Lewiczko, calls this particular strategy, one we share, scandalizing functionalism. And the way I put it is that it names a place where problem solving is also trouble making. I'm interested in I'm interested in work that does not become art too quickly, that can exist in the space of the real. Take, for instance, my favorite painting. It's a photograph, but I call it a painting. One that I've come to call Orange. In November 2004, during the Orange Revolution, named for the color of the popular opposition, Natalia Dmitruk, the sign language interpreter for the Ukraine state television channel, was told to interpret the false announcement that Viktor Yanukovych was the winner of the widely contested presidential election. Instead, she tied an orange scarf to the inside of her sleeve, revealing it with every hand gesture, and deviated radically from the script of the televised broadcast. A flash of orange. I'm addressing everyone who is deaf in the Ukraine. Our president is Viktor Yushchenko. Another flash of orange. Do not trust the results of the Central Election Committee. They are all lies. A final flash of orange. I'm very ashamed to translate such lies to you. Goodbye, you will probably never see me again. The ones to hear the truth first were those who could not hear. And what was amazing about this gesture was that Natalia's courageous act inspired other broadcasters to go off script and to start telling the truth. And this is one of the reasons why the Orange Revolution actually succeeded. And I say succeeded in quotes because it was a disaster, it was a total failure. Viktor Yanukovych is of course back in power, and the whole situation has been corrupt since, but this for me is an artwork that's not an artwork, and it's something that inspires me. I want to bring up sociability, and Patty brought up sociability. One of the things that aggravates me about this term social practice is it began as a psychological term, but it also was called all these other things before it became social practice. So site-specific art, interventionist art, art in the public sphere. The labels don't really concern me, but I also think that artworks themselves are inevitably social. And I'm interested in the sociability of objects. I'm going to show some images right now. These are from April 2003. They're images of an emptied out museum. They're images of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad after the looting occurred in the aftermath of the US invasion. In 2007, I began yet another ongoing project with my studio, where we've been reconstructing life-size the artifacts that are listed as missing, stolen, destroyed, or unknown on the Iraq Museum's database and also at Interpol. 25 assistants to this date have been involved in this project, so a lot of hands and a lot of hands from the American heartland making these apparitions of something that's completely lost. We make the artifacts using the packaging of Middle Eastern foodstuffs and the Arab English newspapers that are given away for free to the Arab communities in the United States. So it becomes a trace, a fragment, where we're enlisting these fragments of cultural visibility to make these things that are now, for all intents and purposes, invisible. The project is called The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, and this just gives you an idea of some of the comparisons between the database and the reconstruction. Now, without talking too much about this work, I want to mention there were drawings. And one of the things that happened in these drawings, which happens often with my projects, is that the news changes as I'm making it. And so one of the protagonists revealed in this narrative about the looting of the museum was Dr. Dani Georgiou. He served as president of the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage and director general of the National Museum in Baghdad. In the aftermath of the museum's looting, he worked tirelessly to help recover some 50% of missing items. However, because the museum continues to be a soft target for insurgents, international policing agencies from Kuwait and Iran to Japan, Italy, and the US are for now retaining any confiscated museum objects. Under Saddam Hussein, Dr. George took part directly in archaeological excavations in order to avoid Ba'ath Party meetings. And this was really interesting. He was an Assyrian Christian, and in order to hold the position he had in Iraq, he had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party. He didn't believe in their ethos, and so something that's very non-traditional is for a director of a museum to suddenly participate in an archaeological dig, but he would telegraph in from like an excavation site in Sulaymaniyah and say, I'm sorry, we found something amazing, I can't come to the meeting. So this circumvention really, really interested me. Dr. George also sidelined as a drummer in a band called 99%, short for 99% of Excellence, that specialized in covers of Deep Purple and Pink Floyd songs. And this is where I fell in love with the man, you know, regardless. And one of the soundtrack for the project, there's an atmospheric aspect, which is a cover of Deep Purple, Smoke on the Water, that I commissioned an Arabic band called Ayyub to play. I'll play the little fragments of it here. In Philadelphia, everywhere else I didn't know. After receiving a letter with a bullet enclosed from extremists who threatened to harm his family if a ransom was not paid, Dr. George resigned his post, fleeing to Syria in August of 2006. In December of 2006, Dr. George arrived with his family in the United States, having accepted a position as a visiting professor in the Department of Anthropology at the State University of New York, Stony Brook. Ahlan wa sahlan, Dr. George. And so the artifacts are displayed with an accession card that has everything you would expect to see on an accession card, like the Iraq Museum number, some of the provenance, but instead of it being a paragraph about how the object might have been used, there were paragraphs about people reacting to the looting. And so on the level of ethics, Daniel prompted me to think about like an aesthetic ethics, or an ethics of aesthetics, but it got me to think about these objects. And the story is always that they were looted, and for some people they were the ticket out of the country as it was being torn apart. But as Dani George explained to me, there were other reasons where the question of ethics, of doing wrong to do right. So this piece has a very nice story. This is Dani's quote. It was taken by 2 young men during the looting. They took 9 very nice pieces to their houses. They came to us after the looting and they said, don't ask for our names or addresses. We were in the museum at the time of the looting. We felt very sorry because we could not stop anything. Then they decided they would take things and bring them back when it was safe. And they did it. As soon as we had the American soldiers protecting the museum, they brought back the 9 pieces. So I started this project in the summer of 2006 when Dani was still in Syria. And it just so happened that I started working with a mutual friend of his in the archaeological community in New York. And I knew he was coming to New York, and he arrived escaping for his life, and I was wondering, you know, how he was going to react to the show about him at the museum in January of 2007. And this very beautiful thing happened where the archaeological community came out to welcome Dani when he got to New York. because he had to leave all his books behind. He had a huge library of very rare books. And the archaeological community found reprints of those books and came and gave it to him as a gift, so they repopulated his library. And I was introduced to him at this event, and he'd already become familiar with the project, and he was really happy about it, but the thing he was most happy about, he said, "How did you get a picture of me playing the drums?" And there's no YouTube videos of 99%, there's no Google Images, there's no MP3s, and so this is how the art newspaper ran their headline. They followed his story from the looting up until now. And so I told them, I found a picture of you looking kind of bored at a meeting, and then I found a picture of this guy doing magical Photoshop. And so he said, "Oh, that's archaeology too." So for me, the whole profession is suspect now. And I was in Chicago when I got these images. So unfortunately I wasn't there, but Donnie came and visited the exhibition not once, but quite a few times, and he would stay for hours and hours, and he would walk gallery goers through the artifacts and give them tours the same way that he would have given a tour of his objects in Iraq. And when I spoke to him on the phone, he told me how emotional he got, and I asked him, why? And he said this is as close as he was ever getting to the original artifacts again. The aura had been replicated, and it was a ghost. And this is doubly sad because Donnie passed away 6 years ago. He was flying from New York to Toronto, and once he got off the airplane, had a heart attack, and he actually died between two countries, which is, of course, the story of the artifacts because it's too dangerous for them to go back, and is, of course, the story of every Iraqi who's arrived since 2003. So this is my grandfather. He's on the left with the three-piece suit, with his family. They're Iraqi Jews who had to leave in 1946. This is him when he was much younger. The photo is, I think, from the 1920s. And you can see the family's so large that they extend beyond the desert oasis backdrop. So this is my grandfather on the right with his younger brother Salim on the left, and they were Arab Jews. And if any photograph shows the fact that there was people called Arab Jews, this is a photo that does that. A history that gets erased in the 20th century as nation states are being created in the Middle East. This is my grandmother, Renee Shamoun in the middle, Marcel, her sister's on the left, and their friend Leonie. This is from a photographic studio in Baghdad. You could almost expect to see this kind of photograph in Akram Zaatari's amazing Arab Image Foundation. My grandmother was hugely influential on me, as was my mother, as I was growing up in a household of Iraqi Jews who ate Iraqi food on the Jewish holidays, and I thought it was Jewish food. I didn't have a matzah ball until I was in college. I knew those were from Sinai or something, and I don't like matzah balls. But so I grew up in this house where Arabic was spoken and all the art was from Iraq. And I heard amazing stories. My grandmother told me a story about scorpions that lived in the basement, and to a 7-year-old, scorpions are super cool. And she also told me about singing towers that told the time. And I grew up with real problems with numbers, and so the idea that you have towers that told the time was really interesting. I would later find out in life that those were the minarets she was talking about, and she would hear them 5 times in the day, and she heard it the 3rd time. She knew it was getting late and she had to go to the market. So for her, a religious sound was a product of secular sounds. So I have these amazing stories from my grandmother. And then on January 17th, 1991, they started to get erased. The first image that I've ever seen on Iraq in real time was green-tinted CNN images of the city under bombardment, of architecture disappearing. And my mother saw the look of confusion on my face as we were sitting at dinner watching this. And she got up and stood in front of the television and she said, you know, there's no Iraqi restaurants in New York. And it was like the Sphinx had spoken. Like, I didn't know what she meant. She's a great cook. I thought maybe she can open up a restaurant. You know, but no, she was actually pointing out that Iraq was invisible outside of oil and war. And so this is a typical family setting. My dad doesn't always look that angry, but this is a Shabbat dinner with my mother making tzedit, which is one of the only dishes you can actually say is like Iraqi Jewish, because it all really is Iraqi food. I'll talk about that later. And then mashki and kabashwanda, and yeah, so this is what I grew up with. On September 14, 2001, I came across a line of people that snaked around St. Mark's Place twice, around the block. And I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe it was a blood drive. You know, people going to donate blood after the attacks. I thought maybe people were donating boots for the rescue workers, but no. It was people waiting to get into an Afghani restaurant called Khyber Pass. And it was the only thing these people could think to do as the drums started to beat towards war, and to actually say that their grief was not a call for war. And to also reassure the family that we were in the restaurant, that they weren't alone. And I thought, like Natalia Dimitriev's gesture, this was like a gesture that was beautiful, that was in art, and it was in the real space of the world. And so once I witnessed that, and once it became clear that we were going to war with Iraq, I asked my mother if we could finally open an Iraqi restaurant in New York. I don't have the overhead to do such things. But we started a project called Enemy Kitchen in 2003, where we've been cooking Iraqi food as a form of resistance against the war. And it was the only platform we could think to create. I was asked by an organization called Mural Arts to work with kids in Chelsea, where the galleries are, who live in housing projects. Most of them are African American, or Latina. And their principals, once the war began, told the teachers not to discuss the war in the classroom. That it was too potentially incendiary an issue, because most of these kids had a brother, a cousin, a mother, a father, somebody that was close to them stationed in Iraq. And I thought that this was really a big mistake. I've done this project with art audiences, and I will never do it with an art audience again. It is so fucking boring. You know, we sit across from each other, and we basically say, I feel like you. Kids will tell you exactly what they think, so will elderly people. And so this is where the project is now when it gets run as a workshop. So this is in 2006 at the Hudson Guilds Community Center, where for 10 weeks I taught folks how to teach, how to cook Iraqi food. And what happened was about 3 weeks into it, one of the students came in, and I wanted to create a place where fearless listening could enable fearless speaking. I wasn't interested in proselytizing. I didn't want to educate, you know, people on the war. I felt like they had the words themselves and just not a platform to actually say it. And so after 3 weeks, one student comes in and says, why do we have to make this nasty food every day? They knocked over the Twin Towers and they blow up our soldiers. And one of the other kids said, okay, you know, Iraq was not responsible for the Twin Towers, it was bin Laden. And then another kid from the stove says it wasn't bin Laden, it was our own government. So in this one moment is this panoramic snapshot of everything, you know. And so about 10 weeks into making the food, the students said, you know, you're moving to Chicago, this course is ending, we know all about your food, you know nothing about ours. And so I said, you know, that's right. And they said, well, can we teach the last class? And I'm a college professor who has a fantasy of the students taking over the school. And so I said, absolutely. So one of the students said, do Iraqis make Southern fried chicken? And I did a quick turn through the Rolodex in my mind of my mother's recipes. And there's nothing like Southern fried chicken. They said, we're going to invent Iraqi Southern fried chicken. So the next week, they marinated the chicken in the baharat, the Iraqi baharat, the spice mix, date syrup. They taught me how to do a shake and bake. I've never done that before. And Iraqi fried chicken was born. And so the project has continued, it evolves, it sort of pops up whenever, like herpes, you know, so whenever an infection is needed, we pop up. And so this is the Iraq Veterans Against the War asked me to cater the Memorial Day luncheon in 2009, so instead of hot dogs and hamburgers, it was cooked on kitchery. And the Vietnam Veterans Against the War were there as well, and it was a very somber event. And then once, you know, we got to the grill and the beer got going, it was really interesting to hear the conversations and the feelings of betrayal from one generation to another. And in even specific discussions about who would you put on trial first, Kissinger or Rumsfeld. And then the project became a food truck that still exists. And the food truck, you can see here, is a 1976 ice cream truck that nobody would insure in Chicago, not because it was from 1976, but because of all the Arabic writing. But we got it insured from Chinatown. And we also have the Chicago flag here, rendered in Iraqi colors, which confuses everybody. And I'm interested in hospitality. You know, I'm interested in the ethics of hospitality. But I also am very interested in discomforts. Now, hospitality derives from the Latin hospes, meaning host, guest, or stranger. Hospice is formed from hostis, which means stranger or enemy. And the latter being terms where things like hostile are derived. So the food truck is staffed by Iraqi refugee chefs and American veterans of the Iraq War, who are the sous chefs and the servers. So it inverts the power dynamic in Iraq, where finally the Americans are taking orders from the Iraqis. Yes. And it circulates the two perceived enemies around the city, where they visit not just areas downtown, but they've stopped outside of like military academies. Chicago has the most military academies in the entire country. And so it's like a dangerous ice cream truck outside these military academies where veterans will actually tell the cadets what they're in for. The host kitchen, Milo's Pita Place. In Chicago, you have to have a host kitchen as part of the requirements. You're not allowed to cook on the truck. And so the prep kitchen was a restaurant. Now, my mother's theory doesn't hold true in Chicago. There are a lot of Iraqi restaurants, but because of the tenor of the conversation in this country, they're too scared to identify themselves as such. So they call themselves Middle Eastern cuisine, or even more weirdly, Mediterranean. Iraq doesn't border on the Mediterranean. But the dead giveaway is when you look at restaurant menus like this and you start to see masgouf, which is the national dish of Iraq, or you see the dessert called gema. And so I approached them because they make the best masgouf in Chicago. And then this is our motley crew. So I'm interested in being a purveyor of discomforts. And so the food is then served on paper plate replicas of Saddam Hussein's hospitality plates that actually relates to another project that I did in collaboration with Creative Time, where they invited artists to work with a high-end restaurant and a really great chef named Ken Velasco. And I guess, you know, if Nato's in the room, he can correct me if I get things wrong, but I think they do a lot of like in-kind donation of food for events, and so the trade-off was that different artists would do projects there. So Marina Abramovich did a dish, Paul Ramirez Jonas did one, Janina Antoni, artists who I really admire. And so they asked me, and I was very interested in the way that high-end restaurants will always tell you where your arugula is from, or they'll tell you what farm your meat is harvested from. So it's a way of making the diner feel good. And I wanted to make the diner feel bad. And one of the projects that I've been working on continuously is a study of the ecology of Iraq, which has collapsed, you know, and it mirrors the human tragedy. And Iraqi date syrup is made from Iraqi dates, which are the best in the world. And after the UN sanctions came into effect in the 1990s, date syrup was labeled as product of other places like Lebanon or Syria, where they don't grow dates, and even more weirdly, Netherlands. And it was a way of them getting around the UN sanctions. And so I would see these bottles that would say product of Lebanon at Sahadi's imports in Brooklyn, and Charlie Sahadi would say, your mother's going to love this, it's from Baghdad. And so I said I want it to say Iraqi date syrup. Whatever we cook, I want it to be made with Iraqi date syrup, and I want you to say Iraq. And they said, the chef was like, perfect, great. What do Iraqis make with date syrup? And so there's a great dessert called devaswarashi, where you mix dates with tahina. And he says, okay, great, what we're going to do is we're going to serve venison. By the way, this is a conference call, but I said it was a conference call. Okay, so they were going to serve venison on top of the date syrup, and he said it's like the American deer hunt meets the Iraqi date harvest. And I said, perfect. Here's the catch. It's going to get served on a plate that belonged to Saddam Hussein and was looted from his palaces after the shock and awe campaign. Dead silence. And then the PR person from the restaurant said, I think we're going to get a lot of press for this. So, this is the situation. In the aftermath of the US bombardment, only days after the museum was looted, ordinary Iraqis went into Saddam's palaces and started to take the chandeliers, the couches, everything. And so it was a dispersal of the symbols of power. And these are those very plates being looted. And I found them on eBay. 2 places. I do a lot of work on eBay. So I found them in 2 sellers. One was an Iraqi refugee living in Michigan, whose father was a high-ranking officer in the Republican Guard and had been killed in the US invasion. And the other was an American soldier who was based in Baghdad, and there were flea markets that the Army approved of where these items would be sold freely to US soldiers. So we were able to corner the market, bought 18, and this is the date syrup, which relates to another project that I can't talk about now. But I imported Iraqi dates for the first time in 40 years. And the dates actually end up telling the story of the refugees because they get sent back and forth to the border with Jordan, and they eventually spoiled. And then when they finally did send them, it became a total scandal, where USFDA and USDA held them. And then they finally ended up in the store. Come to a city where I'm given an hour and I'll tell you the whole story. So this is how these projects get reviewed. So the New York Post ran an article, Saddam does the dishes. And then 2 days before the project was supposed to end, Creative Time received a cease and desist letter from the US State Department being represented by Cox, Podmore, Skolnick, and Shakarchi. And it turned out that they were declared property of the Iraqi people, which I thought was fantastic. In relation to the artifacts, it's interesting to think about what Iraq doesn't want back, and in fact, they did want this back. And so I said, perfect, done deal. I just wanted to go and be able to document the repatriation ceremony. And so this is what happened. I'll let the video do the talking.
In this way, I think the project follows through with a lot of the traces that I was interested in terms of where the object went, where it belongs, the history that's loaded inside of it. I'm somebody who doesn't believe in the destruction of monuments and in the tearing down of symbols of power that people may have resisted or may have resented. I think that's part of the place's history. And I think that when those symbols are erased, you're dealing with an unhealthy amnesia that countries and people tend to fall into.
We're dropping them off right now to the Iraqi embassy. With the Iraqi with Obama. So he was hoping to bring them back on his trip back.
Wow.
I don't know what's going to happen that quick, but wanted to
That's
do
why
it
they
there.
wanted it to.
Wow. Yeah, it came all the way from DC to request to get this done today.
I was a little bit surprised that the Iraq mission to the UN would want back the symbols that the US and many of the people in Iraq had seemed so eager to dispel and to destroy. The address of the Iraq mission to the UN is 14 East 79th Street. We're standing in front of the Iraq mission to the UN, and we're here because the US Marshals are turning the plates over to the Iraqi government. What they told us in Creative Times offices was that they wanted this to coincide with Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's visit to Washington. He was in DC yesterday meeting with President Obama. And they're looking to bring the plates back home to Iraq on the same flight as the current Iraqi Prime Minister. I think the way that embassies and missions work is that you're technically on Iraqi soil, or you're on the soil of the country of the embassy, and so we're on Iraqi soil. So this is the first time my family's been back. So they'll be returned to Iraq
Yes.
tomorrow?
I'm not sure, but very soon.
Okay.
Very soon.
Will it go in a museum or?
Should be.
Should be, yeah. What I heard was that the plates were a gift from the Queen of England,
That's right.
the Wedgwood china. So, and then the more recent china, all different places, Limoges, Italy. Thank you so much, and good luck,
Thank you.
and inshallah, good times ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I had no idea. I honestly thought that we would be in some kind of office where people were getting passport visas or something else, and I never expected this level of the state presence. I mean, these people walking in and out of the room, opening the door, shutting the door. It was like a striptease.
Best new thing in the world today is obviously the end of the Iraq War. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta saying today in Baghdad that Iraq is now fully responsible for directing its own path. The war ending as it should. Iraq now becoming its own sovereign country without our flag flying over it anywhere, without our troops anywhere in it. That's easily the best new thing in the world, maybe this decade. But there's another Iraq story that is ending as it should. It doesn't beat the end of the war, but it's pretty good. This fall, a Chicago-based artist got together with a New York City arts group and a restaurant. They put together an ambitious, big-thinking art project. They found on eBay dinner plates believed to have been looted from Saddam Hussein's palaces after the U.S. invasion. They bought the plates, and as an interactive art installation, they served on Saddam's flatware and plates venison with tahini and date syrup and pomegranates. The project was called Spoils. The artist said he wanted diners to think about how the plates got to their table. Quote, "This is about the symbols of power in that regime that have now come into the ownership of the populace that were living under Hussein," he told the New York Times last month. But you can't just buy Saddam's dinner plates on eBay. Not legally, anyway. When the art group was formally notified that the plates really belonged to the Iraqi people and needed to be returned, they agreed to give them up. So earlier this week, in what the New York Times described as a strange but cordial visit, the artist helped the U.S. Marshals pack up the plates so they could be delivered to the Iraqi mission at the UN. By Tuesday afternoon, the plates had made their way to D.C., where Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was in town to meet with President Obama. The plates were then scheduled to fly back to Iraq with Maliki on his private plane on Wednesday. Which is to say, this ambitious, big-thinking art project ended as it should have. The Iraq War is over. Iraq is a sovereign nation. And one of the very small things that means is that they get their stuff back, too.
So then there was a newspaper headline that wasn't the Yes Men Project that declared the end of the Iraq War, and the very bottom of that page is the plates, you know? So this is the truck. This is Aaron Hughes, an amazing artist, doing a beautiful project called Tea in the context of the truck. He's one of my collaborators that I always come back to working with, a veteran who came back and took up art because art succeeds, in his words, art succeeds where language fails. And he's been reconciling and completely trying to reclaim his humanity and take accountability through these very beautiful projects, and Tea is one of them. And I know some of you in the audience are familiar with his work. Greg Broches, who did a project with one of the refugees on the truck who actually remembered him from Iraq. It's an amazing story that I don't have time to go into here. And this is a two-page spread that we got in Time Out in Chicago in the food and drink section, which is like really, I guess, coveted territory. This pissed off a lot of top chefs in Chicago. We hadn't even sold a kebab at this point, and we ended up with this spread. And because of this publicity and because of the constant flow of traffic to the truck, Milo's Pita Place became, they closed down Milo's Pita Place, which was kind of a small restaurant. They opened up Milo's Palace. And so Milad Chaher, who was the chief chef, had always wanted to open up an Iraqi club. And so in Chicago, you can go to Milo's Palace. It's now renamed Avalon Bistro. And then these are three singers who are somewhat popular in Iraq. This is Ali Rashid. He won Iraqi Idol in 2005. Walid Lasmar and Milad Yunus are rising stars in the Erbil and Mosul, well, no longer Mosul, but the northern Iraqi music scene. And so these are all refugees living in Iraq, and so the club has created this interesting economy for refugees to actually showcase these wonderful, wonderful talents that they have so they can do what they were trained to do. And these posters are amazing. I love these posters. And then, you know, I often talk about like the burden of sustainability with some of these projects, and sometimes we have to think of these projects not as something that's an enterprise. Like there's an entrepreneurial turn that's been taken in these socially engaged artworks, and it's fine, but I didn't sign up to become a restaurant owner. And I think that sometimes we need to think about these things as a compost for other things to happen. And so I'm interested not necessarily in sustainability, but in evolution. So Enemy Kitchen became Milo's Palace, and oftentimes the image of Iraqis is sad. These are Iraqis smiling, so this is a night in Milo's Palace. So very quickly, to conclude here, I mean, there's also a lot of things, like Saddam Hussein's personal sword makers started making me knives and things for the Enemy Kitchen. So why am I here in Philadelphia? Well, I'm here because Liz invited me, so the Mural Arts. And it turns out that in Philadelphia we have a very vibrant Iraqi community. Some of them are in the audience today. We're working together, and it turns out that the Iraqi Walter Cronkite, Bajat Abdul Wahed, is a refugee living here in Philadelphia since 2009, with his wife Haifa Abdul Qadir, who is also a broadcaster. And so as Liz and I started to talk about a potential project, and we started talking with Jane Golden at Mural Arts, my desire was to do my second radio project. The first one I did was in Palestine, and to actually find a way to return the caramel-voiced, beautiful, amazing Bajat Abdul Wahed to the airwaves, but to actually produce an American version of his radio program where the folks he put in the field are Iraqi war veterans. So here in Philadelphia, Warrior Writers is based here with the amazing Lavella Kalika and fantastic people like Kevin Basil and Mike Cunningham, so many people. And one of the things that Aaron Hughes told me was that, narrative therapy, I go through it, and anybody who's suffered from trauma has gone through it, becomes a place where storytelling happens. And it's a place where the landscapes of Iraq and Chicago, or Iraq and Philadelphia, collapse in a safer place rather than in the real world where they actually happen as flashbacks. And I was interested in those hallucinatory moments as kind of surreal ways to recall a place that doesn't exist anymore for people. This this idea of an Iraq that is dispersed in each of the people who've been there. And I've always talked about how the war created two refugees, the Iraqi and then the American veteran who comes back, and they're completely disenfranchised. And so the idea is that they would work together on this program. I used to listen to Iraqi shortwave radio when I was growing up. Where's the images? No. Oh. Did you guys see Bajat? Okay, so that's Bajat Abdul. That's him on the air. That's him a little bit later. I used to listen to Iraqi shortwave radio, and we used to send away for postcards to tell them that we heard their signal right near New York, and we would get these little postcards back. And so we titled this A Desert Home Companion. It's my first attempt at an image. So I'm going to read just the text so we can move through this and I won't be too late. The Philadelphia Mural Arts program will present a participatory performance of radio project by artist Michael Rakowitz involving American veterans from the Iraq War and the Iraqi refugee community. Conceived with independent curator Elizabeth Thomas, the project will invite local veterans and refugees to participate in a creative process to express their experiences and memories of the war. I'm also interested in how Iraqi the war made the American veterans. Creating a space for productive dialogue. Rakowitz will weave together personal stories, cultural traditions, music, and found sound to create scripted passages that will serve as the backbone of a live performance on Independence Mall, It Will Happen, featuring professional performer and veteran Aaron Hughes and former broadcast journalist Bajat Abdul-Wahid. I should also mention Mohammed Al-Bayed and Mayada Humsi, who are in the audience today, who will be essential parts of that team. And his wife, Haifa Ibrahim Abdul-Qadir, among others. The performance will be staged evocatively inside a recreation of Abdul-Wahid's newsroom. That's iffy. Mayada is an amazing, amazing architect and artist, and so we're going to design this in collaboration. A 10-episode radio program and podcast distributed through a network of hundreds of community radio stations anchored by Prometheus, which is here in Philly, will combine recorded elements from the live performance with studio and field-based recordings, offering national audiences an opportunity to engage with an intimate, multifaceted, and sustained portrait of Iraq. I want to thank Prometheus Radio, Alan Gomez, Philly Chem, Lutheran Family Services, Melissa Fogg, Warrior Writers, David Keefe, Lavello, Calico, Kevin Basil, Michael Cunningham. We're going to be working with Intercultural Journeys, Al Bustan, Seeds of Culture, and special thanks there to Hazami Syed and the amazing musician Hama Khoury, who has volunteered to lead the house band for that event. So here's a little animation. And so do you guys want to hear a trailer?
Yes.
Hello, dear listener. I'm Michael Rakowitz, artist and director of A Desert Home Companion, an upcoming radio event about Iraq and its displacements in 10 episodes, presented by Mural Arts for the Prometheus Radio Project and generously supported by a grant from the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage. A Desert Home Companion began as research into the vibrant Iraqi community of Philadelphia. Bajat Abdul-Wahid, dubbed the Walter Cronkite of Iraq, and his wife, Haifa Abdul-Qadir, also a broadcaster, arrived in the city of brotherly love in November 2009. The idea for the radio series was to return Bajat to his role as host. He and Haifa both performed that role beautifully. All our sessions conceptualizing and recording preliminary content for the show has happened in their living room, accompanied by love, warmth, and delicious home-cooked Iraqi food. Their hospitality reminds me of my late grandparents, also Iraqis, who left Baghdad in 1946. Bajat and Haifa's stories have excavated memories of my own from 1991. I was 17. In the aftermath of the first Gulf War, my brothers and I huddled around our newly acquired shortwave radio, scanning frequencies of the place our grandparents fled from. Was it all destroyed by the place they fled to? Was there a pulse? Was there anybody alive out there? Suddenly, something. Birds chirping. The signature call sign of Radio Baghdad.
transmitted in broadcasting service of the Iraqi Republic.
Listening back to this fragment, I wonder if I ever heard Bajat's stories putting me to sleep at night. He must have been behind the microphone on some of those occasions. I used to leave the radio on, inviting the spectral presence of Iraq through broadcast to enter my body as a vessel. In this short sampler, you'll hear Bajat's caramel voice, the voice of Iraq, reanimating his old self and the many pieces of a disintegrated country.
So, Bajat, can you introduce yourself the way that you used to in Baghdad?
There are many news in Baghdad TV or Baghdad broadcasting, 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 10, 12, 5 news. Every announcer begin when the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Finish 6, I said. الساعة ببغداد 6:00 مساء. أيها المستمعون الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. إلى حضراتكم نشرة الأخبار الثالثة لهذا اليوم، يقرأها عليكم بهجت عبد الواحد. في هذه النشرة نحن سعداء هذا اليوم بإلقاء إخوة أعزاء زارونا في شقتنا هذا اليوم، ونحن نرحب باسم المستمعين الكرام.
Hear vintage weather reports for better.
And then silence. Many of my projects are process-based and incorporate the narrative of what happens to objects, intentions, and people. In February, late February, Bajat Abdul Wahid suffered an attack. He has chronic obstructive respiratory disease. And he required emergency surgery. He has a tracheostomy, and the voice of Iraq has lost his voice. Bajat's illness is incredibly sad, but also tremendously important. I cannot ignore the tragic poetry of the voice of Iraq, losing his voice. Thus, the project will enlist this as a critical moment. My team and I were fortunate enough to record Bajat informally, but in high definition. You just heard a section of that, just weeks before he fell ill. Each episode will begin with a voiceover introduction by me that speaks about the initial intentions of the project, only to reveal that once we began to work together, our host lost his voice. In this way, the listener is introduced to the original concept of the work, only to realize that, essentially, our host has become a ghost, another casualty of the war. And I mean this seriously, because when you think about the fact that they were forced to move here from Iraq when they were already elder, one of the things that was revealed is in the Johns Hopkins expansion of the biotech park into East Baltimore, was there's a correlation between the deaths that happen of the elderly residents that have to leave because of eminent domain, people who are age 65 or older, a large percentage of them are dead within 10 years. So this is a casualty of the war. I began this talk with a broadcaster, for those who can't hear. And now I have a broadcaster who can't speak. And when I think about the accuracy and the articulate nature of his inability to speak, I think about how ineffable our world has become and how speechless we are at the horrors. So we've gone from Iraqi hospitality to the hospital. There's no happy ending here. It's not an American story. It's an Iraqi one. I hope you'll tune in next summer when we get this project underway. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Take 2 or 3 questions for Michael that he'll answer as a closing reflection.
the issues that has emerged for me in the sort of latest, in a couple of the convenings of social practice or engaged, artistic, whatever we want to call it, is this, what I start to perceive as my own discomfort at the confusion between ethics and good manners, or kind of a good, kind of notes of behavior about what should be and shouldn't happen. Admonitions of how we should do or not do this practice, which seem to, for me, cut out the possibility of discomfort or even a kind of conflict as part of an ethical, engaged practice, which I think is vital and important.
Thank you, Lucia, for that question. I stand firmly as an artist, and I believe that art can be dangerous, and it should be dangerous, and it shouldn't flinch from being dangerous. This is one of the places where we can actually enact a certain amount of discomfort and circulate it, and maybe even cause each other, yes, pain. But we're always there to follow it up in some ways. I believe that the artist Ika Hailuk talks about not making polite art. And polite art doesn't haunt you. It's one of her things. You know, she talks about also polite art is like a dog. A dog will go and fetch a bone for you. A cat will eviscerate another animal, you know, and bring its organs to you. You know, there's nothing polite about that. You can't run away from that, you know. And that's what I want, you know, because I don't think that by just creating sutures and covering up the wounds that we're actually dealing with anything. I'm really, really, really disturbed by the way apology works. And so I sometimes think that, you know, the folks like Aaron Hughes and the Iraq Veterans Against the War and warrior writers, where they're actually working directly with this uncomfortable material and doing things like turning their uniforms into pulp or paper on which to write. You're not able to run from that. It's tactile, it's there. And so I think this is, for me, one of the things that I stand firm on, is that I like work that makes me feel really good and bad at the same time. And I want it, and this is what stays with me. And there's room for all kinds of work, you know, there's a lot of weak socially engaged, you know, art projects, but, you know, fuck it, how many bad paintings are there, right? You know, so I think that sometimes people maybe misunderstand, or they really feel the need to do something that's completely polite and doesn't challenge, and that's fine. Maybe there's room for it, but it doesn't. I heard this expression for the first time yesterday. It doesn't push the needle. I want to eat the needle.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. By your plates being returned and by your action, did you hear of any other stories of it resonating with anyone else to do the same kind of deed that you did?
It's interesting. I had people from McCormick Spices and Whole Foods who, you know, wanted to advocate for me. And once they found out how oppressive the U.S. trade laws are, there was nothing that could be done. The most compelling circumstance in the aftermath of all this was a soldier named Carlos Garza, who was reading my blog through Creative Time and was a farmer, and asked off of his security detail by giving a lecture about my work to his commanding officer. Like, he didn't say I was an artist, he called me a professor at Northwestern University. So, and people were talking about ad agency and assets yesterday, so I guess that worked. So he got off his security detail, and he actually started to help replant the date groves. And he really wanted to import Iraqi dates, but, you know, and I tried to help him, but it's still impossible. However, the U.S. Department of Commerce made me aware of the fact, and I can't claim responsibility for this, but finally, there's one brand of Iraqi date syrup from Karbala that clearly lists made in Iraq that you can get at Arabic stores now. So And it has some similarities to the box that Alfares made for the dates that were imported. So I fantasize that it's related, but I'm just happy that now maybe it cannot be art and maybe be real life, but unfortunately we know that's not the case.
We're gonna close this session.
Thank you.
Please
Sorry
join
for the
me in
latest.
thanking Michael.